Endeavor here. In my video about my political journey, I mentioned two films which had a profound impact on me as a disgruntled high school teenager growing up in North York. Those two films were two American Civil War epics, Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. I first saw these films when I was 17, and though they're not particularly political films, they were a major turning point for me in developing the worldview that I hold today. Now, I must start with a disclaimer for anyone that doesn't know. I am not an American. I'm in fact Canadian. But nonetheless, I wanted to share just why these two American Civil War films had such an impact on me. So for this video, I'm not going to be focusing on globalism, liberalism, or the decline of the West, but instead, this time around, I'm going to talk about something positive. Two of my favorite films of all time, Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. Both films were directed by Ronald F. Maxwell. Gettysburg, which was released in 1993, is based on the novel Killer Angels by Michael Shara. Gods and Generals was released in 2003 and based on the novel by the same name by his son, Jeffrey Shara, though it actually takes place before the Battle of Gettysburg, making it a prequel. The first film, Gods and Generals, takes place between the secession of the state of Virginia and the beginning of the war in 1861 and the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863. Gettysburg, as the title would suggest, is entirely focused on the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. The films both focus on soldiers and officers of various ranks in both the Union and Confederate armies and their experiences throughout the war. Gods and Generals primarily focuses on Thomas Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate general from Virginia and commander of the famous Stonewall Brigade, played by Stephen Lang. Robert E. Lee, the legendary commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, played by Robert Duvall, also plays a major role in the film. On the Union side, the primary focus is on Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, played by Jeff Daniels and his regiment, the 20th Maine. Chamberlain is also one of the main protagonists in Gettysburg, played again by Jeff Daniels. On the Confederate side, Gettysburg focuses on General James Longstreet, played by Tom Berenger, and his relationship with General Lee during the battle, this time played by Martin Sheen. While these are the main characters of the films, both films include a cast of dozens of characters from different ranks in the two armies, almost all of which are based on real historical figures. I want to make it clear that this video is about these two films, not about the actual history of the Civil War, since it's important to separate movies from reality. Having said that, these films do an extraordinary job of being as true as possible to the history that they're based upon. I know there's no such thing as a historically accurate film per se, but these films make a damn good effort at being as accurate as possible. This may be a controversial opinion, but I often prefer films to the books that they're based on. I feel this way about Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. Though, admittedly, I haven't read the books, I am certain that they could not have portrayed the war as well as the films did. From the set to the costumes, the music, and the battle scenes, they simply could not have done that in written format. They're shot on location where these actual battles took place in the American Civil War. If they were made today, they'd probably use some fake-looking and over-the-top CGI, but these films used thousands of reenactors to make up the two armies. And these were all dedicated history buffs, many of whom had ancestors who fought in the war, who volunteered to take part in the production of these films. They came with their own costumes and props and were committed to reenacting the war as accurately as they could. Gettysburg is one of the most historically accurate films out there. They really did their homework. The channel History Buffs made a great video about the film Gettysburg and how it lines up to the history that it's based on. I must mention that while there's plenty of attention to historical detail in Gods and Generals as well, it's a much more controversial film due to the accusations it supports the Confederate Lost Cause narrative. The Lost Cause narrative is the claim that the Confederacy's cause was noble and had very little to do with slavery. Largely for its sympathetic portrayal of the Confederate cause, Gods and Generals was panned by liberal critics upon its release. Now, there is a fair criticism of the film that you could say that it downplays the issue of slavery too much. It's undeniable that slavery was a major factor in the American Civil War, but it certainly wasn't the only factor. The film portrays slavery, but it does seem like they do it as little as possible. And this would be a criticism I would make of the film, because it could have been an interesting dynamic to see how they would address the issue from the South's perspective. Having said that, I certainly reject the ridiculous narrative pushed by the zeitgeist today that the entire society of the American South to this day is illegitimate because of slavery. And the reason these are such great films, in my opinion, is that they don't give in to this narrative. I wish you'd be able to just acknowledge today that, yes, slavery existed in the South at the time when it was common throughout the world, but that doesn't mean that everything associated with the South is evil. Unfortunately, our culture isn't mature enough for that today. Nonetheless, the reason Gettysburg and Gods and Generals make for such excellent war films is that they're fair to both sides. The films give the perspective of both sides of the war and their motivations. The controversy of slavery at the time is addressed from the Union's perspective. Joshua Chamberlain himself was an abolitionist, but these aren't movies about slavery. They're about the two armies that fought in the Civil War, and this is something we would never get today under the current liberal zeitgeist. Today, slavery and race are the only issues they seem interested in discussing when it comes to the Civil War. We're given a cartoonish image of the South as a backwater of hate-filled racists who fought the war for the sole purpose of prolonging oppression. This is certainly not historically true, and regardless of your opinions on the Confederate cause, this is not inaccurate to portray them as believing that the cause that they fought for was just, because those that fought in the war for the South believed that. One thing Gettysburg and Gods and Generals capture so well is, and I can't believe I'm using this phrase, the cultural diversity among the men who fought in the war. Not only between North and South, but between different states. You have to remember that early in American history, the United States was much less of a single nation, but rather a collection of smaller nations or states. People primarily identified with their state, and the culture would differ significantly from one state to another. And the films do a great job of showing this. The two states that are predominantly portrayed are Maine for the Union and Virginia for the Confederacy. Gods and Generals mostly takes place in the state of Virginia. There's a few scenes which take place in Maine and a few that take place in Maryland. In Gettysburg, the entire film takes place in Pennsylvania. Wider Virginian society is depicted throughout Gods and Generals, including the land, the civilian life, and the politics. However, the unique impression of all of these states, some of which aren't even shown in the films, is given through the men themselves. The unique mannerisms of the men from different states in both the Union and the Confederacy. For example, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and General George Pickett, who are from Virginia, come across as gentlemanly and aristocratic, while a character like James Longstreet, who was born in South Carolina but lived in Georgia, is a lot more reflective of the southern hospitality of the Cotton States in the Deep South. On the Union side, a figure like General Winfield Hancock from Pennsylvania embodies the archetypal Yankee, while a character like Colonel Chamberlain from Maine reflects a more localized and humble way of life. The film even portrays the Irish immigrants who ended up fighting on both sides. They fled their home nation only to end up killing each other in the country they thought was their salvation. The hierarchy of the armies also affects how the men experience the war differently. Generals such as Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson are motivated by a sense of duty towards their home state of Virginia, while the character of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the commanding officer of the 20th Maine Regiment, who had been a college professor before the war, is much more idealistic, seeing the Union's cause as one that's worth fighting for. Among the common soldiers, what's on their mind is their villages, their homes, their family, and their fellow statesmen. Whilst the generals see their states as these metaphysical entities which they have a responsibility for, the common soldier sees his state as his home. Their motivation is their small place in the world where they feel they belong. And while the North and the South fought each other in a brutal war, the film portrays a sense of honor which remained between the two sides. After all, it was a civil war, with Americans fighting Americans. Among the officers, while locked in a strategic match of chess with their adversaries, they maintained a gentlemanly respect for one another. This is best shown in Gettysburg with the indirect relationship between General Winfield Hancock of the Union and General Lewis Armistead of the Confederacy. It's a true story that the two of them had been friends before the war, serving together in California. Throughout the battle, their minds are on each other, knowing that they're fighting on the other side. On the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg, both Hancock and Armistead were wounded in Pickett's charge. Armistead, who had been wounded and captured by the Yankees, died only 2 days later. Sadly, his friend General Hancock, who would survive, was unable to visit him due to his own wounds. The common soldiers, while a lot less aristocratic than the officers, maintained their own sense of respect between North and South. Not as gentlemen and contemporaries in their field, but more as simple men with the shared experience of having to risk what little they have in the world to fight a vicious war over political conflicts much bigger than them. So how does the film interpret the war itself? Because since 1865, there's been many different interpretations of the American Civil War. There's an interesting series of videos you can watch on YouTube from Columbia University on the historiography of the Civil War. It explains how the perception of the war has changed over time. For example, after World War I, the consensus among academics was that the war was an avoidable waste of life, that hundreds of thousands of people needlessly died due to incompetent politicians. In the interwar years, that's how World War I was viewed, and the same narrative was now given to the American Civil War. Following World War II, the modern West's foundation myth of the Second World War, which I'm sure everyone on the dissident right is aware of, was now applied to the American Civil War. This interpretation has an extreme bias towards the North, that it was a just war to end slavery. The role of the Allies is applied to the Union, the role of the Axis to the Confederacy. The role of the Jews is applied to black slaves, and slavery is likened to the Holocaust. On the other side, there's also been extremely pro-Southern interpretations of the war over the years. That it was a war entirely caused by an aggressive North, unwilling to recognize the constitutional rights of the Southern states. I reject both these narratives, by the way. Why I think Gettysburg and Gods and Generals gets it right is that it shows both sides of the conflict in a fair light, something that is a must for a good war film. That both sides had a cause of their own with a variety of motives, and rather than accusing one side of being the sole villain, it shows how the two sides were dragged into the tragic conflict due to a divide which neither could back down from. By humanizing both the North and the South, the films are able to capture the real tragedy that the war was. That the men who fought were not these faceless drones, but fathers, sons, and husbands. And for each man that died in battle, that meant one mother, wife, or child whose loved one was not coming home. And while the films acknowledge the great loss of life that the war was, they're also able to capture the heroism of the men that fought in it. I think the contrast between the tragedy that the war was, but the heroism of the men who fought, is best displayed by what I consider to be the best two scenes in each of the movies. My favorite part of Gods and Generals is, by far, the scenes of the Battle of Fredericksburg. In December 1862, the Union Army of the Potomac, under the command of Ambrose Burnside, clashed with the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, under the command of Robert E. Lee, near the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. The battle began on December 11, 1862, with the Union forces building pontoon bridges to cross the Rappahannock River near the town of Fredericksburg, when they were attacked by Confederate sharpshooters. Unable to build the bridges, the Union sent men across on boats, supported by artillery fire, to secure a position on the other side of the river. The following day, the Union forces were able to cross the river and occupy Fredericksburg after small clashes within the town. The Confederate forces withdrew to their main position on the ridge known as Maury's Heights, south of the town. The Confederates had a huge advantage with an elevated fortification overlooking an open field which the Union would have to cross. But with a numerically superior force, General Burnside ordered a frontal assault on the Confederate position on December 13th. The attack was a complete disaster, with wave after wave of Union men being cut down by Confederate artillery and rifle fire. Many of the Union forces were even trapped on the fields overnight into the following day, unable to retreat under enemy fire. After the disastrous attack, the Union forces withdrew back across the river on December 15th. It was one of the most lopsided battles of the war, with over 12,000 Union soldiers killed, captured, or wounded, compared to only 6,000 on the Confederate side. The Battle of Fredericksburg is portrayed masterfully in Gods and Generals. This is where the film shows the real tragedy of the war. Prior to the attack on Maury's Heights, there's an ominous mood that pervades the Union forces as they anticipate what is to come. During the assault, the Union forces bravely, though futilely, march into a barrage of bullets and cannonballs. What is emphasized the most is the horrific loss of life suffered. Once the attack fails, an overwhelming sense of dread fills the Union forces as they overlook the battleground covered with their fallen soldiers as they withdraw through the town. As he watched his forces inflict heavy casualties on his enemy, General Lee said to General Longstreet, one of the most famous quotes of the war, "It is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it." In contrast, while the best scene in Gods and Generals really shows the heartbreak of the war, what I consider to be the best scene in Gettysburg shows a very different side to the war, the bravery and heroism of the men who fought in it. My favorite part of Gettysburg is the scene of the 20th Maine's defense of Little Round Top. On the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, the Union forces were positioned on Cemetery Ridge to the south of the town of Gettysburg, which, the day prior, the Confederate forces had driven them out of. They were positioned in the shape of a fishhook upon the ridge. The 20th Maine Regiment, under the command of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, was placed at the far left flank of the Union line on a site known as Little Round Top. The Confederates attacked Little Round Top on the second day of the battle, hoping to break through on the sides, causing the entire Union line to collapse. The 20th Maine were positioned where they could not retreat, else the entire left side of the Union line would be exposed. They were attacked 3 separate times by the 15th Alabama, each time repelling the assault. After an hour and a half of combat, the 20th Maine had suffered major casualties and was running low on ammunition when the 15th Alabama regrouped for a 4th attack. Knowing that it was unlikely they'd be able to hold off a 4th assault, but that retreat was not an option, Chamberlain ordered his men to fix bayonets and to charge down the hill at the enemy. The charge caught the 15th Alabama so off guard that they turned and fled, with a number of them being captured, and the left flank of the Union line held. This scene is absolutely gripping. The men of the 20th Maine are shown not as these fearless warriors, but as ordinary young men with their minds on their families back in Maine. Brave, yet afraid of the task that they have in front of them. During the battle scene, you get a real sense of how desperate their situation is. They hold off attack after attack, becoming more and more exhausted with each assault. Their situation becomes frantic when their casualties begin to mount and their ammunition begins to run out. Knowing they can't hold any longer, Chamberlain makes the bold decision to fix bayonets and to charge down the hill at the 15th Alabama. The scene climaxes with the epic charge of the 20th Maine down Little Round Top, halting the Confederate advance and miraculously saving the day. Once the fight is over, the men are overcome with an enormous sense of relief, but also only then realize how incredible their actions really were. For me, this scene captures the real valor of the men who fought in the war. While the war was brutal and tragic, there still were brave men who, in the face of great danger, made the incredible happen. When the war started, Joshua Chamberlain was a simple college professor in Maine. Who would have thought that it would have been him to make such a courageous decision which would save the day in the most pivotal battle of the war? So other than the fact that they're phenomenal war films, why do I love Gettysburg and Gods and Generals? Well, I mentioned in my video on my political journey that these films inspired me to take a greater interest in history. First into the American Civil War and then later into other historical eras. But I believe that when I saw these films as a 17-year-old boy in high school in a modern, progressive, cosmopolitan city, they had a much deeper effect on me, which I think now I have the words to express. While Gettysburg and Gods and Generals are not particularly political films, for me, they were absolutely pivotal in developing the worldview that I hold today. And I think that's because they're chock full of themes from a more authentic and fulfilling way of life that I was lacking in the modern world. And I'll try to explain what a few of those are. First of all, the idea of home. One major theme in these films is the sense of identity that the men who fought in the war derived from their home states. As a boy who grew up in a modern multicultural city, the idea that there exists a small piece of land where all its inhabitants share a history and culture, have a unique accent and manner, and from which they derive a sense of community seemed completely alien to me. Of course, I was aware of the idea of patriotism, but I always associated that with a larger country and an abstract set of ideals. But the idea that it's the little things that make a home, and that could mean so much to someone that they would march into a barrage of cannon fire for it, was something that I just couldn't see in the modern world. Sure, I might have considered myself a patriotic Canadian, but could I ever feel that way about Ontario or even North York? Did I feel a real belonging in the land that I inhabited? No. Secondly, another theme from Gettysburg and Gods and Generals that influenced me is hierarchy. In the films, the generals are aristocratic, but at the same time, that comes with a greater responsibility and loyalty to their states. The ordinary soldiers, while lower on the hierarchy, seem fulfilled by their own place in the world. That they have their land, their family, and their culture, and that they are content with that. In the West today, we're raised with an egalitarian morality in which we're taught that hierarchy is evil. But the way that the hierarchy of these two armies, which reflected American society at the time, was portrayed in the films, it made it seem much more natural and healthy rather than oppressive. That hierarchy brings order because it gives leaders a greater attachment to their society and instills them with a sense of responsibility to it. What also resonated with me about these films was the theme of masculinity. With the exception of a few minor female characters, these films both have an almost exclusively male cast. Now, they never disparage femininity, but that's just not what these films are about. They are masculine films. And that is very important because I believe that there is a special bond that only men can share with each other. Men are competitive creatures, there's no doubt. They seem to crave struggle and achievement, and there is no greater struggle than war. Now, that's not to glorify war, because I believe there's ways that you can achieve this without war, but there's a reason that the soldier archetype has been revered by men throughout history. Because men want that feeling of achievement. The films also portray a fraternal relationship between the men who fought in the war, be it between generals, the men within a regiment, or even between men on opposite sides of the war. They weren't all best of friends, of course not, but they all seem to have a common understanding of each other as men. Despite being stuck in a brutal war, there's a 19th century gentlemanliness that the men all seem to understand. That being a man required you to live up to a code of honor. And this too was something that struck a chord with me as a 17-year-old boy. A boy can only ever feel fulfilled when he becomes a man, but modernity offered no pathways to that. What was my struggle going to be? How was I going to prove myself? There was no ways to do that. There weren't any real ways to express masculinity in a modern progressive city, with the possible exception of sports. Men are feminized and told that masculine virtues are evil. The broken relationship between the genders in modern society is often talked about today, but I believe that there's also a broken relationship within the genders too. While men's relationship with women is surely important, they also need a sense of togetherness with other men. I'd imagine the same is true with women, but that's something I could never be part of. These films made me long for a male fraternal community, one in which a sense of honor and duty among men can develop. But today, everything is co-ed, which leads to it being feminized. Modernity offers no way of forming that special bond that men share. Lastly, I think the overarching reason that Gettysburg and Gods and Generals made such an impact on me is the culmination of all of these themes. Struggle, hierarchy, masculinity, heritage, homeland. All of these are sources of what I wanted most of all, meaning. My initial dissatisfaction with modernity was how it lacked any real purpose that extended beyond consumption. And that's really the basis of the reactionary worldview that I hold today. So I'd say the biggest impact these films had on me is that they planted the conception in my mind that instead of the nihilism of the modern world, a more life-affirming way of existence was possible. And of course, I wasn't immediately red-pilled, so to say. It took me several years to fully be able to comprehend what I wanted from the world. But these films were pivotal in sending me on that journey. And that is why I love Gettysburg and Gods and Generals. Two timeless pieces of Americana which helped change my outlook on life. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. If you'd like to support the channel or join my Discord community, you can now do so. With the recent waves of censorship on YouTube, it's important that we support Bitchute as a platform. So I ask that you subscribe to me on Bitchute as well, where I will be posting content that is exclusive to Bitchute. Links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.